It's turn 4. You're at 5 life, facing a board full of minions. You look at your hand, filled with cards that can't help you. You pull up the menu. As your hero explodes, one thought comes to you. Why does everyone play aggro? Aggro is like the bane of control players, really. And even like some mid-range players hate playing against aggro, mostly because they don't understand, and a lot of times aggro will get free wins. What I mean by free wins is like aggro will just play all the cards and just win because they played all of their cards. Like it can be a frustrating experience when you're like trying your hardest to like make decisions on what cards to play, and then like somebody just beats you by like puking out their hand. I'm gonna explain why players choose to play aggro and why it feels like you're playing against more aggro than you probably should be playing against, right? So the first and probably the primary reason a lot of people play aggro is because it's cheap. Tempo Demon Hunter is probably the one of the most aggressive decks in the format, and it's probably the best deck. So this is going to be a bit biased, but look at that dusting cost, 4560. And you get a lot of these cards from playing the one adventure, so you don't even have to craft all of them. So it's mostly just the legendaries are what you're gonna have to craft. But even then, 4560 is pretty cheap. If we compare that to Highlander Hunter, which is almost 13,000 dust, I mean, that's almost 3 times as much as what Tempo Demon Hunter cost. And it is at least 3 times. It's still the same. Like, Dragon Druid has the same concept. It's still a really cheap deck to play. Highlander Mage is probably considered a control deck. The Highlander Mage plays like a control deck and is also, again, very expensive. Galakrond Secret Rogue, a mid-range deck, 10,000 dust. And again, you look at Pirate Warrior and Murloc Paladin, they don't break over 5,000. So why is that the case? The answer is that a lot of small aggressive threats are commons or rares. So let's like just looking at Demon Hunter, all these cards were common. These are basic cards, common. There's an epic card here, but most lists have only been playing one copy of this card. Common. There's 3 legendaries in the list, and then like, so there's like 2 epic cards, a few rare cards, and mostly commons and basics. Compare that to Highlander Hunter, where you have some commons and basics here, but then you have a rare, epic, legendary. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 legendaries. And this may be unfair because we're looking at Highlander. So even looking at Galakrond, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 legendaries here for the deck to be really playable. And then even on top of the 6 legendaries, you have a couple of epics. Really, the legendaries are where the most of this cost comes from. Usually aggressive decks don't require that many legendaries. And in fact, at the beginning of the game, when the game first came out, aggro decks really didn't require any legendaries because most of the legendaries that were good were high mana cost. And it wasn't until later that Blizzard realized this and started pushing aggressive legendaries. We saw that in the form of Patches the Pirate was probably the biggest contender, where every aggro deck had to have Patches the Pirate in it because he was so good before he got nerfed. So that was another legendary that was a legendary that was pushed, and there's been a lot more since then. Even looking at like Kayun, Sun Fury, Metamorphosis. These are very aggressively pushed cards. Murgle McGurgle is another aggressively pushed card. You want this out on turn 2, and it's very aggressive. Yeah, and that's I think the only legendary in Murloc Paladin. And I think that's about it. Face Hunter is another one. This has been a mainstay throughout like all of Hearthstone. There's 1 legendary. And like you could play this deck without the legendary. It's your top end. So that's the primary reason I think a lot of people initially pick aggro. They don't want to play aggro. They just want a cheap deck to be competitive. But there is more strategic reasons behind picking a control deck. One of those is the fact that the games happen quicker, right? If we take a peek here, Tempo Demon Hunter games take about 6.6 minutes. Highlander Hunter games, on the other hand, take place over 7.3 minutes. And now this is in gold, so probably not the best. I can actually sign back in. So let's look at legend players. So in legend, we have Dragon Druid, Egg Warrior, Highlander Hunter. I didn't want that for the dust because it counts what's in my collection. So Dragon Druid takes about 6.7 minutes to play per game. Again, I said that was an aggro deck. It really is, even though it doesn't feel like it. Egg Warrior, a control deck, takes about 8.1 minutes to play. Highlander Hunter, a mid-range deck, takes about 7.1 minutes to play. And then Tempo Demon Hunter takes 6.4. So let's round this here. Let's take Tempo Demon Hunter at 6 minutes, So the aggro deck takes 6 minutes, mid-range deck takes 7 minutes, and the Egg Warrior game takes 8 minutes. So if we look over the course of an hour, so if we just round down here, aggro games take 6 minutes, mid-range games take 7 minutes, control games take 8 minutes on average. So that means, let's say we have 2 hours per day to play games. All right, so that needs to be, first we have 120 divided by 6, which leaves you with 20. Then we have 120 divided by 7, is 17-ish. And then 120 divided by 8, 15. Right? So if we were playing a control deck versus an aggro deck, we get 5 more games in. And a mid-range deck, we get 3 more games in, playing aggro. And now the reason this is good is because if we translate this into a win rate, so let's just say we have a 50% win rate. Right, this is 10 wins, this is 8.5 wins, and this is 7.5 wins. Right? And so the reason that this is important, the reason you want to translate this into wins is because how many wins you get in a row is really how fast you're going to climb on the board. So if we can get more games in, theoretically, we get to climb faster. So if you have anything above a 50% win rate, it is more efficient to play with an aggro deck because you get more games in. So this is a big reason that people play aggro, even though it might not be the best deck in the format. So we see right now in the meta, Tempo Demon Hunter is the best deck in the format, but let's say we have a situation where aggro wasn't the best. There will still be a lot of people trying to play aggro. We've seen this throughout, like, Zulok has almost always been a deck because of the fact that people just want a fast deck that can play that has a hard time running out of gas because of Warlock's hero power. Pirate Warrior and Murloc Paladin aren't very good decks at the moment, but they're still seeing play because people just want to play as many games as they can in one sitting. So if you want to rush to Legend every month, it's technically more efficient, assuming you have an equivalent win rate across all 3 types of decks, it's more efficient to play with an aggro deck. Another thing is that I think there's a misconception when it comes to aggro decks that they're simpler games. I disagree with this, and I'm going to have to create a video sometime where I'm going to talk about this, but I think there's a concept that is pushed, a narrative that is pushed, that aggro decks are actually simpler to play, and I think this is bad for the game as a whole, honestly. But I think that people who don't have confidence in their own skill and their own abilities will often play aggro decks because, oh, it's just cheaper, all I have to do is play all my cards and win the game. And it does work like that. I think it puts people behind and not understanding fully how to play the game because they think that it's simple and they'll win games by just playing all of their cards, but they're not understanding the nuances in the card game. And that's when I think a lot of people will get stuck at lower ranks. But to keep with focus with the topic of the video, people perceive that aggro decks are easier, and therefore they will pick up aggro decks because they're intimidated by how complicated a control deck would be. And now we have some math for the last reason. Something that's interesting is that let's say there was an even distribution of aggro deck, mid-range deck, and control decks. Let's say that 1/3 of the meta was aggro decks, 1/3 of the meta was mid-range decks, and 1/3 of the meta would be control decks. You would think as if you queue up into a match that you'd have a 1/3 chance of facing one of these, assuming that there's only 3 decks in the meta in this hypothetical meta. The problem is that's inherently false. Let's say we have 1,000 players playing each of these decks. There's 1,000 players playing aggro, 1,000 players playing mid-range, and 1,000 players playing control, for a total of 3,000 players, right? Now, I talked recently about how long it takes to play a game in an aggro, mid-range, and control deck. So that can actually be applied. Let's say, again, you only have a 2-hour period to play Hearthstone in a day. Well, every time you queue, what's the chances that you're going to run into an aggro, mid-range, or control deck? Let's say over these 2 hours, an aggro deck, one player playing an aggro deck gets 20 games in 2 hours. So by getting in 20 games in 2 hours and only having 17 games of mid-range and 15 games of control decks, so we multiply that by 1,000, we get 20,000, 17,000, and 15,000. So that means if there's an even number of players playing each of these decks, there's quite a bit more. There's 3,000 more aggro games happening than mid-range games, and there's 2,000 more mid-range games happening than control games happening. So what this means is that you're almost 20% more likely to play against an aggro deck than a control deck. And my math may or may not be perfect, and this isn't representative of an actual metagame, so just take this as theoretical. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is because aggro can play faster games, they play more games, and because they play more games, you're more likely to queue up against an aggro deck. This is something that I think a lot of people forget about when they think about. A lot of people understand that aggro decks have faster games. A lot of people understand that aggro decks will play more games, but they don't see what that has the effect on in the metagame, which means, and this is interesting, because when we look at HS replay technology and whatnot, Tempo Demon Hunter only has 11,000 games. Dragon Druid has 30,000 games. Aggro has 25,000 games in Legend since the last balance patch. So let's just look at this in the last 7 days. So in the last 7 days, Dragon Druid has played 20,000 games. Aggro has played 17,000 games. This means that there's actually, if the math is correct here, and we look at the duration of a game is 2 more minutes, a minute and a half longer than a Dragon Druid. That means there's actually a lot more people playing Dragon Druid than there is playing Egg Warrior than there is playing Dragon Druid. Which is interesting because there's less games recorded. And you're more likely to run into a Dragon Druid when you're queuing in Legend, even though there's more people playing Egg Warriors. So this is really why you run into more aggro decks than you really think you do, because as a control deck, your games are going to be longer. You're not, especially if a control gets into a control mirror, those games run really long, and aggro decks and aggro mirrors run even shorter. So with of course, with variance, and we're just looking at averages and just theory, you're going to run into more aggro, even if it's not the best deck in the format. And when it is the best deck in the format, you're going to run into it even more. One thing I just want to say as a conclusion is that I think a lot of people complain about aggro, but have never actually played aggro. I think it's pretty important that before you complain about a deck or how powerful a certain deck is, that you play that deck and you understand what happens behind the deck. And now that isn't possible for everybody. Maybe just watching someone else play the deck and realize how many decisions they have to make, especially with Tempo Demon Hunter. I was one to initially think that, the deck was just like hit you in the face, put down a Battle Fiend, make it real big and win the game. There's a little more nuance to it, especially after the Twin Slice nerf. A lot of the plays that you make aren't very obvious. You have to think about how you get certain value out of different things. I'm having the same thoughts right now about Dragon Druid. I feel like Dragon Druid is just one of those play your cards and win the game. So what I need to do is play some games before I complain about it and understand how the deck works, and it's probably more nuanced than I initially think, so just give that a thought. I think that's it for me today. If you really enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, and if you want to see more of this kind of video, please leave me a comment and subscribe. Now, if you want to see me play games live, I do play in Legend. In fact, I may or may not be in Legend because the month is about to reset. So I'm going to be grinding that on my stream this Thursday and Friday. I stream Monday, Thursday, Friday at 9 p.m. Central Time. So you can find my Twitch link in the description. And thanks for watching.